How many times have we been engaged with an apologist speaking in defense of the Bible? And we go right to Old Testament slavery, right? Slavery is wrong. This seems rudimentary. And yet the apologists, I don't know, the tap dance they do is just bizarre. So I just finished narrating the Audible audiobook of Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? Written by Dr. Joshua Bowen. Dr. Josh is with me. Hey, brother. Second edition. That's what we're calling it, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Because your first version came out 3-4 years ago. Is that right?
Yeah. And it was about 200 pages, I think, in the end. This one, I think, tapped out at 702. So it was,
Josh, I mean, this seems rudimentary. Slavery bad. Slavery bad. And yet, especially online, I mean, what kind of stuff are you hearing? What kind of stuff are you? What kind of things are you hearing out there?
Yeah, it's one of these things that I thought back in 2018 when I first started kind of talking about this topic, I thought it would be something that would be fairly short-lived, right? I'd go and I'd say, okay, look, I get it. These Hebrew words are kind of complicated, or it might be unclear what some of these passages mean, but look, let me just show you what the text says. Let me show you the ancient Near Eastern background. And now you realize, Christian apologists, that it's like the real slavery. It's not some kind, gentle slavery. And the apologists would then say, oh my gosh, well, that's terrible, right? We shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be defending that. And instead, what I'm getting is, well, maybe slavery is not immoral then. Sort of a strange way to go with that.
Well, what I hear a lot of is it's indentured servitude. These were volunteers. They owed somebody some money or a favor, and so they just thought, well, I will sell myself to someone else. And then it's kind of a deal where I can hop out of that arrangement at any time. You hear a lot of that, right, John?
Yes, definitely. And certainly, there is, in the ancient world, including the Hebrew Bible, there is indentured servitude. It's definitely not something that you can just hop out of whenever you like. This is the real kind of slavery. So even if, from the standpoint of the law, someone did voluntarily enter into a slave contract, 2 weeks into it, you can't then say, well, that was fun, but I'm going to go try my hand at something else. But the biggest thing that I get pushback for, if somebody isn't coming back at me with, well, that verse doesn't mean that, or, this passage, you're misunderstanding that, which, generally speaking, I don't get a lot of direct pushback like that, which, it's better. It used to be that way. Now what I get is, well, Josh, how do you even know that slavery is immoral? Like, what is your ultimate foundation for morality to even say that slavery is immoral? And it's just such a weird thing. I think when we get to that point, if I'm having to try to convince you that owning another person's property is bad, like I feel like it's close to the same place as me having to convince you that, rape is bad or murder is bad. If we're there, I don't know, in a lot of ways in this argument, I feel like I've won.
Well, it's a shoot the messenger thing. It's the objective moral standard. If you don't believe in the standard bearer, then how do you know slavery would be wrong? You should at least not care about slavery. They don't realize how insulting the claim really is. If you don't believe in my God, then you probably are a slavery, murder, and rape endorser. I mean, it just comes off like that, doesn't it?
Yeah. And with those types of people, ultimately what follows hand in hand is this idea that if they didn't have God, this will come out in the long run with them. If they didn't have God, if they didn't believe in God, boy, they'd be a terribly immoral person. To which I say, like, well, keep believing, please, right? Because if you need God to be a moral person, well, then hang on to that belief. Because boy, I don't want to live in a society where you don't believe anymore.
I saw an apologist on the debate stage in my own home state do that very thing. He's like, I'm so thankful for my relationship with Jesus Christ because, man, if I didn't know God, I'd be out there doing all kinds of harm. I'd be a domestic abuser and I'd probably be stealing from people. He just said it like that. And his interlocutor said, well, in your case, I'm kind of glad you believe in God, right? Because otherwise you'd be a nightmare, right?
Yeah, yeah, no doubt. And this is what's so frightening, though, I think, about the slavery component to this discussion, because quite the opposite seems to be the case, right? It seems like if a fundamentalist evangelical didn't hold to those sort of core tenets of fundamentalism, then when I show them in the Bible that this is actual real slavery, they would be free to say, well, gosh, I must be, I must be misunderstanding how to read this text, because certainly this interpretive framework that I have, I shouldn't be walking away from these passages saying slavery is okay. So it seems like it's actually that fundamentalist framework that's causing them to say, well, if it is the real kind of slavery, then maybe slavery is not bad in and of itself. Maybe owning people is okay. Maybe it's, maybe it's moral.
Dr. Joshua Bowen, I know I jumped right into the deep end with you. Real fast, for those just now being introduced, can you give me sort of your credentials, for lack of a better word? Tell everybody what it is that you do and what you bring to the discussion about slavery in the Bible, please.
Yeah, so I went and got a bachelor's degree years ago in religion from the very conservative university, Liberty University. And I was a fundamentalist evangelical for 26 years. And so when I finished my bachelor's degree, I then went on to get a master's in theology, which is like a 126 semester hour graduate degree from, again, another very conservative fundamentalist school called Capital Bible Seminary. But I really focused in on Hebrew and the Old Testament. And I learned Aramaic and Akkadian and Syriac and Ugaritic and all these other Semitic languages. And so because of that, I went and applied to get into the program at Johns Hopkins University to study the broader ancient Near East. So I got into what's called the Assyriology program, which is studying the languages and cultures of ancient Iraq. And because of my background, I minored in Hebrew Bible. And so I have a PhD in ancient Near Eastern studies, majoring in Assyriology, Sumerian, Akkadian, those types of languages, but then minoring in the Old Testament and Hebrew Bible. And so, because of that, what I do sort of public facing work online and try to make the Old Testament, the wider ancient Near East, easier to understand, more publicly accessible to interested non-specialists. That's sort of my focus.
One of the sort of snarky responses I've had when I told people that I had narrated your audiobook, I think this is number 3 that I've done for you. And for those claiming that I am completely operating with self-interest here, okay. Yeah, whatever. I mean, I want people to be a part of the conversation. And I'm proud of the work. I think it came out to be about 9 hours of recorded audiobook. But a lot of people, when I post the link, they're like, did it take you 9 hours to say, yes, the Old Testament does endorse slavery, which is kind of I get it, right?
Yeah.
I get that on the surface, but it doesn't address the larger question of why and how, right?
Yeah.
Why and how does it operate? What do the ancient laws say? How do they inform the writing of the Old Testament and the command structures? How do they echo other Near Eastern laws? These are tools in the toolbox if we're going to engage the apologist. So I just think snarking, well, of course it is slavery. And then you just sort of, go off and congratulate yourself for being so clever. That bugs me a little bit because it ignores really the nuts and bolts of slavery. Are you seeing that? Some people are like, why would you write a whole book? The answer is yes, right?
Oh, yeah, no doubt. And, for certain people, I think that's probably okay. But these are people that I think that are not going to have maybe the patience, and that's okay. But, they're not going to be actively engaging with people either in their family or online, in the details of the discussion. And again, I think that's okay. Certain people just, that's not their thing, and I think that's fine. But if you are interested in having a conversation where you say more than just, well, yeah, it obviously did, let's move on. This is the type of material that's useful. I was out with Megan last night, and we were watching the Barbie movie, and I got a message on the app Clubhouse from a friend of mine, Tom Rabbit, and he asked me, "Hey, what's the best argument against this Exodus 21:16? It's illegal to kidnap someone and reduce them to slavery. I've got this apologist that's sitting here telling me, well, here, look, Exodus 21:16 says you can't kidnap people and reduce them to slavery. Doesn't this mean that there is no slavery?" Well, that's something that if you just say, well, obviously it endorses it, you're not going to be able to answer that question. And that's sort of what the book is designed to do. It's designed to take, apologetic arguments that get down into, as you say, like the nuts and bolts, the specific passages, and to say, look, here's a passage that says slaves can run away and you can't return them. How do you address that? Well, I mean, if you're just saying to somebody, no, it does, and you don't know anymore, you're not going to be able to address that. And the chances are that if you actually do talk to somebody about it, that passage is going to catch you sort of flat-footed. And it might seem like something that's hard to answer on the fly. So I think it's an important thing to sort of be armed.
I think one of the challenges, though, is we say, yes, it existed in the Bible, and the apologist says, no, it didn't. Yes, it did. No, it didn't. I mean, there's no real dialogue happening there. I also think that some of the tactics of apologists are trapping you. And the nature of these types of debates is not, hang on just a second, that's an interesting claim that you've made. Can we take a moment and research that? If you want to pause and you want to go do a deeper dive and research the claim that is made, the style over substance vibe of some of these debates makes you look unprepared and weak. It's one of those weird things about debating, right? If you are thoughtful and you take a pause and say, well, let's find out, you tend to look unprepared for the discussion, right?
Yeah. And that's really, I know we always talk about like how things are and how they should be. Certainly that is a way that things are. And we wish that they were different, right? We wish that interlocutors would come honestly to these discussions and say, we want to get actually to the truth. But that's not the reality, right? And even not in a formal debate, right? Even sitting at the dining room table over Thanksgiving with that fundamentalist, cousin that you have, any pause that you have there, any question that you have is even in that case, I think, going to be seen as well, I got him, I got her. And that's what the stuff that I write, it's specifically designed to equip someone to have those conversations. So the other two books that you did the audio versions of, the Atheist Handbooks to the Old Testament, volumes 1 and 2, like that's what they do, right? They go through specific topics and say, like, here, this is how you talk to somebody about, did Moses write the Pentateuch, or is there violence and genocide in the Old Testament? Those types of things. But here with the slavery discussion, there really are certain passages that everybody wants to go to, right? Everybody that's an atheist or an agnostic or skeptic, they want to say Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, Exodus 21, 20 to 21. Like, they want to come out with those. And that's good. I think they should. The problem is the apologist is going to go, yeah, but. And then instead of engaging with those verses, what they're going to do is throw a different verse at you. They're going to say, yeah, but look, let's just assume slavery is really bad in this Exodus or this Leviticus 25 passage. Here in Deuteronomy 23, it says if a slave runs away, you can't return him. So it doesn't matter how bad it is, right? Because if the slave runs away, you can't return him. So all they had to do is leave, right? And at that point, if you don't know that verse, if you're not aware of what it says, boy, it's tough. It's tough to engage with that. And there are certain passages, there are certain arguments that come up over and over and over again that, again, if you're not ready for it, if you haven't thought about it, if you haven't, read something or listened to something about it, it can be very difficult in the moment to engage with those verses in a meaningful way.
I don't want you to read the audiobook or read your book for everybody here, but I just want to touch on it. One of the responses is, well, have you read the New Testament? Have you read the New Covenant? Of course, even if there was slavery, it was God's attempt to work within the system that was in place. These primitives, they did slavery. And so God was kind of trying to speak in their primitive language. It's that bigotry of lowered expectations. And then they bump into the New Testament and say, but the New Covenant hates slavery. That's bullshit, right?
Yeah, in a word.
Okay.
Yes. And this is one of the things that's new in the second edition, is going into what I call the aftermath. And that's looking at, what does the New Testament say about the topic of slavery? What is the early church? What do they think about the topic of slavery? How do they understand what the Old Testament and, of course, Jesus and Paul and other New Testament writers, what did they interpret that to mean? And then ultimately we get into the antebellum South. But I mean, as far as the New Testament is concerned, the Old Testament is setting out laws, right? This is how most of the passages that people engage with are in the legal collections that you find in the Pentateuch. In the New Testament, the situation culturally is different, right? The chosen people are not being presented as being in power, right? It's not coming from a top-down approach where they can set laws. Instead, when you read Paul or when you read Jesus, it's very much from a bottom-up approach. They're under the thumb of Rome, right? Or they're under the thumb of people that are above them, and so you would expect in that case maybe a little bit, us to be a little more relaxed about it. They're just kind of, maybe that's a place where they're kind of engaging with it. The problem is that Jesus makes some very still definitive statements. Things about divorce. He's very clear, Matthew 19, what he thinks about divorce, flying in the face of what it says in the law in the Old Testament. And so it doesn't seem like Jesus has a problem saying, yeah, you guys, you have this in the law, but really from the beginning it wasn't like this. It wasn't God's intent, right? Moses is just working with you here. He's cool to say that about things like divorce. But when it comes to slavery, not only do we not see condemnation of it, but we actually see things like Jesus using hypothetical scenarios, analogies, where slavery is a given, right? And he's saying, which one of you having a slave, to his apostles, which one of you having a slave would allow him to do this? No, of course you wouldn't. You would make him go do the hard work. And so it's very difficult, I think, for an apologist to find a place in the New Testament where certainly that it condemns slavery. I know of nothing that condemns slavery, but it's even hard to find something that seems to suggest that it's not a given, right? It's not something that is understood to sort of be the way, that maybe that it should be.
Was there some pushback in the Old Testament time? Human rights advocates against slavery?
That's a tough question. I don't know that they would have pushed back on it necessarily from a moral standpoint. Instead, what they were, I think, trying to do was say slaves in and of themselves have humanity, right? That these are humans. And generally speaking, this was more focused on people that were debt slaves, people that had come into this position of enslavement through having some type of a debt or a loan, or they'd been pledged, and in such a way that it was assumed ultimately that once the debt was paid off, they would return to their free status, which is tricky in and of itself. And so I think often based on the humanity of the slave, there were certain regulations that were always put in place in the ancient Near East, including the Hebrew Bible, to mitigate things like slave abuse, certainly killing a slave, And so those types of things are very common to the ancient Near Eastern law collections. And again, they show up in the Hebrew Bible as we would expect. And the other thing that you see is that there does seem to be across the board preferential treatment for, for lack of a better term, citizens, right? So if you have a law collection for a particular country or, for a particular nation, laws tend to be better for citizens than for foreigners for the same type of thing. So, certainly in the Hebrew Bible, for example, you can see things like you can charge interest on a loan to a foreigner, but you can't do that to a fellow Israelite. And if you take a Hebrew slave, you have to release them after 6 years. They're freed in the seventh, and of course in Leviticus 25, this changes a little bit, even in this regard, where ultimately, they weren't allowed to keep Israelites as slaves any longer. You had to keep them. They had to keep them as hired workers.
But if I can jump in quickly, Josh, forgive the interruption. The fact that they would differentiate between the treatment of in-group slaves and out-group slaves, that's a moral referendum, right? I mean, that's a moral judgment. They're like, well, I don't want you to treat our people the way you would treat other people. Is that a good way to say it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always reticent to make those types of moral, I guess, claims about a text, primarily because I don't work in ethics.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're talking about the Israelites, right? We don't want to do this. We're not going to do that to the Israelites. We're not going to hold them to this strict of a standard. That, to me, I know we're inferring, but it seems like they kind of knew that the tougher rules applying to the out group kind of sucked for them, right?
Yes, and definitely. And I think maybe the way that I would want to nuance it is I don't, because this is something apologists want to point out. Well, look, it says here in Leviticus 25:39 that you can't keep Israelites as slaves anymore. So that means that they knew that slavery was immoral. And I don't think that's what's going on. I think what they think is slavery for Israelites is immoral, not the institution itself. It was very important for them to distinguish between this people group and that people group. And this actually, I think, sort of addresses one of these big apologetic arguments, because so often one of the first things that comes out from an apologist's mouth is, well, slavery wasn't race-based in the Hebrew Bible or in the Old Testament as it was in the antebellum South. And it's like, yeah, I mean, so what? So what if it wasn't? So what if race wasn't the distinguishing feature? Would it be okay if like hair color was the distinguishing feature? We can enslave people with blonde hair, but not with brown hair. Like, is that really okay? And I mean, because what you're having to say is, well, I guess it's okay if, in Leviticus 25 you enslave foreigners. That's okay, but just not Israelites. Does that make it better for the apologists? That's what I fail to understand there when they bring up the race.
Kind of a tribalistic model, isn't it? It's us and them. It's okay to enslave them, or at least hold us to a higher standard, to relax the rules a little bit. Speaking here with the Syriologist, Dr. Josh Bowen. He is author of several books, including the second edition, Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? Ancient Near Eastern laws, the Old Testament, a lot of parallels. You've spoken about how it's not really stealing whenever the Old Testament sort of emulates stuff that came before, because cultural borrowing was normal. We addressed that in your book before this, as we got into the Atheist Handbook for the Old Testament. And people said, well, they stole Noah's Ark from Gilgamesh. And you were revealing that actually culturally it was normal for myths to be borrowed and built upon and altered. Was the Old Testament like the previous Near Eastern laws? They just borrowed some and they enhanced and altered. Would that be a way to say it?
Yeah. One of the things, as you're just pointing out, that is so important is utilizing older material. I mean, we do this today, right? When it seems like it's very rare for completely new Christmas carols to come out. I haven't like run numbers on that, but I feel like every year we kind of have the same Christmas carols, so the same Christmas songs. They might get reworked, like a remix version or something. But really, we're utilizing old material, and because people value in certain contexts and certain genres this older material. It's revered. And this is, I think, a good parallel to what we see in the ancient Near East. And so with mythologies, they would utilize earlier mythologies and rework them and polemicize them quite often in order to make new theological points. And the same was true with the legal collections. So we have lots of examples, and we go through them in the book, of older legal collections, law collections, going back into the 3rd millennium BCE. And, those law collections have striking parallels with what we see in certain parts of the Hebrew Bible, particularly places like Exodus 21 and the Covenant Code and the sections about slavery. They parallel the laws of Hammurabi actually quite closely. And so one of the important things to do, and what we did in this second edition, is to do a lot of comparative analysis. So let's look at all of the ancient Near Eastern law collections and what they say about slavery, and then look at what the Hebrew Bible says in its law collections. And what you end up seeing is that there are not only parallels, but the reality is that so little is changed, relatively speaking. In other words, when you look at mythologies, like you brought up the flood tradition. The flood tradition is very specifically reworked in order to make a theological statement about Yahweh. But the law collections, while you might have some reworking and some intertextuality in that sense to bring about something new, for the most part, the laws in the Old Testament are just on par, particularly about slavery, with what we see in the wider ancient Near East. And we have an entire chapter where we go through that and look at all the comparative
as I'm
material.
reading it, right, it's like the laws of Hammurabi and the laws of Libet Ishtar and the laws of Eshnunna, blah, blah, blah. And these predate Old Testament, or are they contemporary to Old Testaments? They emulate or originate so much of what we read in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, etc., right?
Yeah. So like the earliest law collection that we have that we dealt with in the book comes from the late 3rd millennium, so around 2100 BCE. And, most of the other law collections come from the 2nd millennium, but, you're talking about 1,000 to 1,500 years before the biblical text. And so, yes, much earlier. And this is, it's really fascinating what scholars say and how they write about how that may have transmitted down to the writers of the Hebrew Bible. But I mean, for our purposes, it's terribly relevant. It's just the fact that we know that the writers of the Hebrew Bible are utilizing broadly this genre of law collections, writing law collections, but in some cases very specifically drawing on much earlier material.
Which is part of the point, the idea that Yahweh originated these ideas, right? He's the one who came up with the specific rules and laws for this culture. And then the next question is, well, did he also tell Hammurabi? Did he tell the other cultures to do the same thing? And then he had the Old Testament written. I think it's one of the great counter apologetics out there as people talk about how inspired the Old Testament is. Let's get into a difficult but necessary conversation about sex slavery. The indentured servitude argument simply falls apart against the reality that women were sold into sex slavery in the Old Testament. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, it's this is something that I think often gets passed over, gets sugar-coated, gets slightly reinterpreted in such a way that we can move past it and not have to really deal with the reality of what these passages say. And again, the idea here is not to condemn an ancient culture, um, but it's to realize what it is that these texts actually are saying, because people that are looking back to the Old Testament to say this is what we should base our moral, our moral system, our ethical system on. These are problematic passages. So in Exodus 21, verses 7 through 11, you kind of get your first example. There's a man who is fallen into debt, and the law says that he can sell his daughter as a slave to a man to compensate to pay off that debt. And that man has the right, the purchaser has the right to either take her as a concubine for himself, or he can give her to his son. In other words, he has the authority to say, you're going to marry me, or you're going to become a concubine of me, or of my son. And the law, sets in place some protections for her in that situation. And those are the things, by the way, that apologists will tend to really focus in on. Well, look, the law is seeking to protect her, right? And the problem is they gloss over the fact that she's being sold. And so we talk about in the book what's happening here is there is no consent on her part. It's irrelevant. She is being sold. She is passive in this transaction. And what she's being sold into is her use sexually, right? The use of her sexual capabilities. So either being sold as at best, like a slave wife, but probably more likely just concubinage, because the text says that he can take another for himself. And so like this, when we talk about sexual slavery, like they would not have considered it sexual slavery in the ancient world like as we would today. But sexual slavery is someone whose sexual capabilities can be utilized by force by someone. And that's what's happening here. And you see this even earlier in the passage, but it's the woman is even more passive. In verses 2 to 6 in Exodus 21, it talks about a male debt slave who comes into servitude single, and his master gives him a wife. This woman is a chattel slave. And it's not that she has the option, all right, do you want to marry this guy? No, the master is utilizing both her and the male slave for their sexual capabilities. So the man to aid in the production of more slaves. And so when that woman gives birth to a child, that child is the property of the master, becomes a slave, him or herself. And so like this is, by our definition, strictly chattel slavery that is sexual in nature. And again, it's sexual slavery as you see in verses 7 through 11. And one more very briefly, because again, it's something that gets glossed over quite commonly, is up in Deuteronomy chapter 21. This is the passage about women who are captives from war. And an Israelite man could see a beautiful woman among the captives and say, I want to take her as a wife. There is no consent here on the part of the woman. She's a captive, right? And so, of course, by their standards, they would not have thought this was sexual slavery. But indeed it is.
When we read the verses, Josh, it's so insidious, right? Because it's not just the kidnapping of females for sex slavery, but they bring them in and essentially change their identity, right? Mm-hmm. Change their clothes and cut their hair. And I think it says cut their fingernails, and then give them 4 weeks to mourn the family that's been slaughtered. And then now you got a woman. And I think if you and I had quoted this story and attributed it to the Quran in front of someone who was not well-versed in the Christian Old Testament, and I do this from time to time, I'll go in and be like, did you hear about the woman being forced to drink the bitter water to see if she was an adulteress, and then the fetus would flush out of her body, and all those types of stories, but I attribute it to another religion. And people are aghast. Christians are like, that's just barbaric. People need to reject these horrible stories. It's so evil. And then you flip the switch and you say, this is the Bible. And they wink out, right? But it's so insidious. Change their identity. Let them mourn for a few weeks like it's no big deal. And then she's all yours, right?
And the reality here is that that month of mourning very likely is, put in the text to sort of soften it. But probably what's happening here is this is to ensure that she's not pregnant, right? Because part of what was going on here was, a man is setting up a situation where he can have a legal heir. Right? This is part of the rationale here. If you want to have a legitimate legal wife with whom you can produce an heir, this is how you do it. And so this month to mourn is very likely to see if she's going to have a period, right? To ensure that she's not pregnant. And so, yeah, I mean, again, what apologists will do with this very, very frequently is say, oh, well, I mean, sure, it sounds bad to our ears, but I mean, like, what else was the guy supposed to do, right? Leave her out there on the battlefield to die, or, let her become a slave. This honestly, in many cases, I think this is just coming from often a male perspective that just doesn't understand the severity of what would happen, and what a woman would experience in this context. But I mean, even more broadly, it's just trying to, as you say, sort of wink at some of the more atrocious and insidious implications.
Yeah, we get into Numbers 31, right? I mean, God's army goes in, slaughters everybody, but kidnaps the virgin girls. And the apologists are like, well, it doesn't say that they became wives or concubines or that they were abused sexually. I mean, for all we know, God's army was doing them a favor, right? Their lives were spared. What a beautiful story. And I'm like, all right, you just slaughtered, mom and dad and siblings and friends. You just slaughtered everybody in their life, and then you kidnap them into your home, and you're doing them a favor. I mean, it's really offensive.
And to sort of top it off, if anybody listening ever does talk to someone about a passage like Numbers 31, take them where the women that are captured, these virgin girls that are captured, are numbered along with the other spoils of war. So, so many thousand cattle, so many thousand, other types of property, so many thousand women, and they're divided up as spoil. So really, I mean, it's very difficult, I think, to read through that passage and in good conscience walk away saying, no, this was a really good thing that you were doing for them.
The context argument is always a pain in the ass, right? Well, you're taking it out of context. Well, let's say all of us have misunderstood the whole concept of owning other people, including sex slaves, as property. Why would a benevolent, an omnibenevolent Yahweh not come and give us the context we would need to properly understand these verses? I mean, I've got all of these experts, and they've written books to explain the book, which I do not get. I mean, the Bible's not enough, so now I need someone else. And then the expert books disagree with each other, and it's Thunderdome out there. But if God really gave a shit, he would come down and say, this is exactly what I meant, and this is exactly what I mean today. That seems, I don't know, obvious to me, right?
And this is really the more, I don't want to say comical, because it's certainly not funny, but odd aspects of this topic to me, because the scholars that are working in the field in something like slavery, they don't all disagree, right? This is part of the reason that I wrote the first edition of the book, and obviously now the more expanded second edition. But the whole point was to just tell everybody, hey, look, people that work in the field on this topic, they all agree on this, right? They're all saying it's the bad kind of slavery. There's debt and chattel slavery. And so it's really only in these online discussions or, discussions amongst, family members. In other words, people that are outside of the field. This is really the only place that you have this topic question, because go pick up an evangelical scholar or a quote unquote liberal scholar, and all of them are going to say, yeah, I mean, sure, the Old Testament endorsed debt and chattel slavery. It's like it's what it did, right? Or it sanctioned it, whatever, word that they want to use to talk about how the text says you may do this, right, in the law.
Yeah, but let me jump in, Joe. How did the theologians justify that? Because as you have said, actual scholars in the field agree almost universally. It's the online apologists that are, trying to do the tap dance. But if you're a theologian who is a Christian, how do you get around that if you believe that chattel, debt, and sex slavery did happen in the Old Testament?
And I think that's a really good example of this is in the antebellum South, right? And I'm certainly not an expert of that historical period. But, anti-slavery theologians, they were, primarily, as I understand it, the progressive Christians, right? They were the ones that said, well, gosh, these passages sure do seem to say what the slavery, the people that are pro-slavery, it does seem to support their position. We must not be interpreting this correctly, right? We must have to take a more liberal approach. And so we want to focus, instead of looking at these passages like the legal collections, we want to look at more broad statements like love your enemies, right? Or, God came to set the captives free, right? So we want to look at these broader, big picture statements and say things like, well, it was God, as you pointed out earlier, like God sort of working with the people where they were. But
God can do whatever he wants because he determines what's moral. So the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. We're the ants in the anthill, right? So if God wants to burn us all with a magnifying glass, that's his prerogative. I've heard that one before.
Yeah. And ultimately in that case, like if everything that God does, is a reflection of his nature, and that's where morality comes from, well, then whatever it is that God does is by definition moral. And it's just it becomes a terrible, terrible position for someone, because then you have to say things like, 1 Samuel 15, where God commands that everybody down to infants and babies be killed with a sword. That's moral because God commanded it, right? And that's not a position I want to defend. That's
huge double standard, right? Because they wouldn't take that position with Allah or any other deity anywhere, certainly any human dictator. I know we're on the clock here, but I want to have you kind of pitch what the book is. Just give everybody the rundown of what they're in for. I mentioned it's about 9 hours in audio form, and the actual book itself is a great resource because it also has a bunch of appendices and references. It's a deep dive, right? I mean, even as I was narrating, I'm like, am I qualified to read this? I did feel that. But give me the rundown of the book real fast.
Yeah, basically, the book is designed for anybody that is interested in discussing, did the Old Testament and ultimately the Bible endorse the practice of slavery? Is it real slavery? Is it like some sort of nicer version of slavery? Should we be calling it, like, as Seth said, like indentured servitude, or is it really chattel slavery? And what I do, not only do I go through all of the specific passages in the Old Testament that deal in the laws with slavery, but it really focuses in on comparing all of those laws to the laws in the wider ancient Near East. And so there's a whole chapter dedicated to what were those laws in the ancient Near East, how did they function, what apologetic arguments are made based on those. And then it gives overviews of slavery in the ancient Near East, slavery in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and then it goes through the specific passages about slavery. Then it has a whole chapter on comparative analysis. So, when you see in Exodus 21:16, it says it's illegal to kidnap people. Well, gosh, that sounds really bad. Well, were there other laws in the ancient Near East that said you couldn't kidnap people? Spoilers, Yes. And so we go through all of them. And then there's a chapter that talks about the New Testament, the early church, the antebellum South. Like, what is it in this aftermath of the Old Testament that these texts were utilized? How were they utilized? And then finally, there's a chapter that just deals with any other major arguments that apologists and people in social media bring about these texts and about these passages about slavery. And then, of course, in the print version, there's hefty appendices. But I mean, really, I think that the audiobook really captured what most people are going to need it for.
You're very kind to say that. Well, it's, I think what I love about you and Megan, beyond the fact that you're stellar human beings and dear friends, is that you take, even though you're kind of a geek, egghead type, and I say that as a compliment, Josh, but you let the rest of us play along. All right. To those of us who don't have a PhD, who are not a Syriologist, who are not Old Testament scholars, you phrase it in a way that doesn't condescend to us, but is written in a language that tools us up for these necessary conversations. Links to the book and audiobook in the description box. Thanks for writing it, because I'm sick and tired of the not that they're going to stop, but I'm sick and tired of the apologists trying to tell me that it either didn't happen, that it's out of context, or that it's okay because Yahweh decided slavery. Thank you for writing the book. Dr. Joshua Bowen, you are much appreciated, my friend.
Thank you, Seth. I appreciate you having me on.